Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We are standing between you and happy hour, so I apologize for the timing, but there is champagne outside if you want to go grab a glass. We will not take any offense to that. So thank you for staying. This is a really important topic, near and dear to our hearts. Thank you, Scott, for the warm welcome, and to the LSI family. He did a great job introducing me, so I don't need to belabor that. But I have an esteemed panel here of experts, and I want each of them to introduce themselves before I get into the meat of the presentation today and the panel discussion. So Gretchen, do you want to go ahead first?
Sure, thanks, Tonya. My name is Gretchen Nelson, and I am the Director of Clinical Affairs for Neurology and Digital Health at MCRA. I've been at MCRA about 4.5 months. Prior to that, I was with Abbott for 12 years in 3 different divisions: cardiac rhythm management, neuromodulation, and vascular. I ran clinical trials there, from boots on the ground in the sites, collecting the data, all the way up to managing, directing, writing protocols, and executing on all clinical levels. Prior to that, I was also with J&J for 7 years in sales and marketing.
Thanks, Gretchen. We do have one panel member who is not with us, although she videoed her introduction, so we will run that now.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your time, and my sincere apologies for not being able to attend in person. But hopefully I'll still be able to share with you some of my experiences in real-world evidence. So currently I am the Director of Neuroregulatory Affairs at MCRA. And prior to coming to MCRA, I was at the FDA for a little over 7 years, first as a lead reviewer and then as a clinical trial and real-world evidence policy analyst at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA. So as a real-world evidence analyst, I reviewed past submissions that have used real-world evidence to really identify some insights that we could use to train review teams and strengthen the consistency across the different review areas. I also integrated regulations, and I also interpreted them, and as well as guidance to determine the applicability of FDA regulations on real-world evidence activities for medical devices in particular. So I'm really looking forward to being a part of this panel, and I hope that I will be able to attend in person.
Thank you, Devjani, and she will be on-demand video through the panel presentation. Nicole?
Okay, so hi, I'm Nicole Fitzpatrick. I'm a Senior Manager of Evidence Development and Market Access at MCRA. I have over 15 years of experience that spans the continuum from research to market access. And I started my career actually back as a neuroscience researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, after which I then joined the university innovation community for several years to help drive promising research projects towards commercialization. And so I worked with a lot of fledgling technologies to help them develop some of their initial evidence and also develop some of their business cases for moving forward into commercialization. And then prior to joining MCRA, I was actually a leader in the development of the Vital Innovation Program at Highmark Health. And this was a program where we work closely with companies with emerging technologies to develop real-world evidence in our system. So Highmark was a payer-provider system, so we had access to both clinical and claims data, and we were able to run prospective studies to understand the evidence from a clinical cost and experience standpoint, and really develop evidence packages for driving reimbursement and coverage decisions. And the team now that I'm on at MCRA is doing very similar work, assisting clients with developing evidence and also communicating the value of their solutions in order to drive that market access.
Thank you, Nicole. Mina?
Yeah, hey everyone, thanks for sticking around. I'm the lone man out. I'm not part of MCRA, but I'm super indebted to them. They actually are consulting on a 510K with us. I have the pleasure of serving as CEO and president of a company called MediView. We are an augmented reality surgical navigation company. Basically think about X-ray vision for clinicians during percutaneous procedures. So background is in class 1 through class 3 products, R&D, go-to-market, structural heart electrophysiology, and I've always kind of been an entrepreneur and eventually just said, okay, it's time to be an entrepreneur. And with that, the appreciation of what real-world data Means in our capacity is a big deal because we have to be able to demonstrate, hey, it's not just a cool shiny toy that has really cool holograms, but actually adds real value. And so that's an area that we have actually built into our solution. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a little bit, about how can we integrate real-world data collection into product design. That'll be one area, and then my other backgrounds really have been in the space of entrepreneurship, in the heart valve space, the cardiac ablation space, the orthopedic space, and really for us, working with MCRA has been helpful on the 510K side, and I'm sure we'll be working them even more when it comes to the real-world evidence and actual data generation side. So it's a pleasure to be part of the panel, and thank you all for letting me participate.
Thank you, Mina, and thank you, everyone. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, again, just to introduce MCRA, we are a full-service integrated consulting organization and a full-service CRO. We have about over 150 employees. We are based in DC, Connecticut, and New York, and also remotely based, of course, post-COVID as well. And we have an very experienced leadership team and staff at MCRA. We really have branched out into multiple therapy areas, including electrophysiology, imaging, orthopedics. We're born in the orthopedic and spine world, but really are going into now digital health, diagnostics, cardiovascular, neurology, biologics. So really taking the whole gamut of the disease areas and bringing our expertise to the table for innovators in these spaces. Our model is really an integrated approach, which is so important because the regulatory strategy needs to inform the clinical strategy, and the reimbursement strategy, market access strategy, commercial strategy needs to inform the clinical strategy as well. So if we've all heard the quote, "In God we trust, all others must bring data," from W.E. Deming, I think everybody in this room understands the importance of data and evidence, not just for regulatory clearance or approval, but to really establish market adoption. So we'll talk about that a bit more today in terms of the utility of real-world evidence in the real world with various stakeholders. So today on the panel, again, we have the innovators' perspective, we have the payers' perspective, we have the clinical perspective, and also the regulatory perspective. So it's important because all of these stakeholders really have a different play and agenda in terms of what they're going to need for real-world evidence. So again, looking at that broad area of stakeholders, just in terms of real-world evidence, you've got facilities, hospitals, integrated delivery networks, you've got payers, the payer entities, we've got patients, of course, employers. We are a very employer-centric and focused healthcare structure and ecosystem here in the United States, and also physicians. So really thinking and taking that into account. What is real-world data and real-world evidence? I feel like those acronyms are thrown out quite a bit, but really looking at the definition of real-world data, and that is relating to patient health status and or the delivery of health care routinely collected from a variety of sources. So really what is that, what is happening to that patient through electronic health records, medical claims data, doing a retrospective analysis, registry studies, patient-generated data, including home healthcare settings, and also really new and emerging to the market, digital health. So really taking that data that's coming in asynchronously from digital health applications is going to be, moving forward, is going to be really important as we move forward in generating real-world evidence. So real-world evidence, so using the data going into real-world evidence, is the clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits of the technology or intervention we're talking about, or diagnostic. So generated using different study designs, including RCTs, externally controlled trials, observational studies, registry studies, retrospective claims analyses. So really, let's ground ourselves in those definitions. It's important to really consider kind of three stakeholders here and what they're looking for in terms of evidence in general. So if we think about the FDA, they're looking at evaluating the device itself for efficacy and safety, and thinking or asking, do the benefits outweigh the risks for the device? On the other side of the coin, if you think about payers, And purchasers and hospital systems providers, they're looking to evaluate the impact the device has on health outcomes for a very specific and defined patient population. And they want the demonstrated effectiveness, not just in a controlled clinical trial, but how is it really being used and what impact is it having on the population health in real-world settings. And that data, of course, needs to be published. So having that end-to-end evidence generation strategy that really speaks to all of your stakeholders and considers every stakeholder you're going to need to, to really work with is important for market adoption. So FDA's use of real-world evidence, and they have really a defined use of it. The 21 Century Cures Act of 2016 required that the FDA establish a program to use real-world evidence in, to support new indications for drugs or devices. There was guidance, draft guidance that was published in 2021, and it was informed by a lot of demonstration and pilot projects that were happening. If we think about from the payer's perspective and who's really bearing financial risk for managing a patient population, there is no defined real-world evidence program from the payer's perspective. The only one that really comes close is CMS's NCD or CED, coupled with a CED. So NCD is National Coverage Decision, which requires coverage with evidence development. That's kind of a real world evidence protocol or requirement. But that mechanism for coverage is not the norm. So there's not really a defined pathway or set of regulations that the commercial payers use, for example, or the integrated delivery network. So there's a lot of room for improvement there and to establish some commonalities and consistent programs. But I think if we think about the shifting model from a fee-for-service type of payment structure in the US to alternative payment models or those types of payment models that focus on value versus volume, I think real-world evidence will certainly come much more into the foray as important. I think it's important to think about the utility of real-world evidence for medical device innovators. Most of you in the room are, medical device innovators, payers, employers, and consumers. So thinking about the purchasers, payers, and employers, they can measure the actual costs that are paid in the system from both the payer and the consumer, and accurately capture the impact on concomitant therapies, comorbidities, adherence challenges, and other factors that really differentiate the real world from clinical trial settings. If you think about consumers, the increase in growth of high deductible health plans, the consumers really want to know, is this technology, drug, device, diagnostic going to work for me, and is it really worth my spend, maybe? So really thinking about that as the consumers really become more of an educated purchaser of healthcare. And then also from the medtech innovator standpoint, using acquired data to develop actionable decision-making and clinical utility. So our digital health and diagnostics is really important. Understanding really what the clinical utility is of your diagnostic, for example, to understand what impact is it making, so you can really demonstrate that and use that in your claims as you work with your customers. And then supporting these realized outcomes with value analysis committees and other stakeholders is important. So really considering bringing in real-world evidence to your evidence generation plan in total. So we'll jump right into the panel discussion, and I'm going to move over to the chair here, transition. And the first question, hi, everyone. First question for the group is, how can real-world data be used in your respective areas when thinking about the entire product life cycle? For example, product development, regulatory, clinical, reimbursement, and post-marketing surveillance. Anybody want to go first?
Sure. Well, I think because I've been in industry for so long, I've been forced to think about that whole life cycle, from the thought process all the way through to marketing. And what I've seen is a lot of times clinical studies will be set up to show a result that doesn't always is seen in the real world. So it gets to market, and when it's there, people are asking, well, why aren't I seeing the same thing? And physicians are wondering, you know, I see in your results here that you showed this much pain relief, or this happens, and I'm not seeing this in my practice. So I think when you think about setting up clinical trials, you have to think of taking it outside of the box of sitting in an office, writing up a protocol, to what happens in reality, what happens in the physician's office. And running a clinical trial in that manner will get you the results that you will be able to show in the real world once it's approved. And I think a lot of times you don't have the ability to be like boots on the ground and get an understanding of what that's like. A lot of us come out as PhDs, scientists, and we're very scientific in our thought and not really what's gonna happen. Right. So I've been forced to kind of think of how real world data will work and champion ideas when writing up protocols to increase that awareness and bring it back to what we're seeing in the real world.
Great.
Okay, I'll give the kind of payer perspective. So I do think that, starting off, a lot of technology companies, rightly so, are very focused on sort of regulatory and getting kind of over that hurdle. And I think that once they're over that hurdle, there's sort of an open-ended question as far as, what evidence do I need now? How do I get to full market access? And I think the truth is you do need additional evidence. So just taking a payer standpoint, for example, from the clinical perspective, of course, they're interested in sort of your, standard RCT outcomes, but I think there's additional evidence on the clinical side that they're very interested in as well. So things like, what's the clinical outcomes compared to the current standard of care? I think that's very important. So, is it better than the current standard of care? And if so, how much better? They're also very interested in sort of longer term outcomes. So, post 1 year outcomes, at least 1 year, but even more is better. And then also sort of what is the quality or level of the evidence that you're bringing to the table from the payer perspective. So they do want to see very strong clinical outcome data, in terms of study design and statistics. And then on the economic side, I think there's also evidence that you need to bring to the table for the payer. So looking at cost and utilization, again, how does that compare to the current standard of care? Is it more or less cost effective than the current standard of care? And then, probably the third thing I would say is around clinical utility. Mm-hmm. So I think we hear this actually from a lot of payers. Is there clinical utility? So how does this new product fit into the current workflow? How does it affect treatment decisioning downstream? I think that you're able to leverage real-world data to sort of answer all of those different questions and start to develop sort of that evidence package that you can then bring in front of payers.
Great, thank you, Nicole.
Mm-hmm.
Mina?
Yeah, data's awesome, right? I think that's one of the things that I think a lot of the time, though, it's not from the innovator's perspective, it's thought about too late. And one of the things that we really try to put an emphasis on is having the foresight of what type of data you want to collect from the time, from the entire patient care pathway of what was their referral pathway. And in our world, in cancer ablation, for example, there's only 24% of indicated patients that even find their way to ablation relative to the other options of chemotherapy and resection. And you start asking questions around why. And you actually find that, hey, there's therapies that have reimbursement, there's data there, but we use it as a way to uncover, hey, what claims are they trying to make? Where is it falling short? Where are there evidence gaps? And then we use those questions to really influence product design. So that's more on the upstream side of using existing data, gaps in data, and influencing product design. But you asked about the entire life cycle, yeah. And we also think downstream to post-market surveillance. And that's an area, and we'll talk about a use case a little bit later about how can you use post-market surveillance internal, right, to the internal company's process they have in place to understand, for example, CAPAs and understand problems in the field, and then tie that back to corrective actions because, right, we're judged on that, and those things are audited, and the type of justification for root cause analysis and understanding of how am I going to fix it is a big deal. And for a company like us that we're trying to push the spectrum of technology being used in the OR, right? You say XR in the OR. It's you got to convince people, and that only way that comes is if you can show tangible benefit with a solution to encourage that adoption. Because we've got, we think, pretty sweet technology, but at the end of the day, right, it's the voice of the customer and the clinician voice that's going to drive it. And quite frankly, you don't get that as a freebie. You don't get that as a luxury unless you really have the clinician buy-in to frame what type of data is collected when, and then use that, peer-reviewed publication around that entire life cycle is a big deal for us, both upstream and downstream.
Yeah, you both touched on something really important, and I think it's important to impart on the audience here. And I think, Mina, you mentioned, really the importance of early market assessment planning, right? And understanding, and you, Nicole, said, where does the technology fit in the current care continuum? Can you speak a little bit about how important it is to really have an appreciation and understanding upstream so you can really make those claims downstream and develop the right evidence?
Yeah, so is right now the time to talk about some of the use cases? Okay.
We can, yeah.
So, for us, right, one of the things that we want to help is increase access to ablation. And we try to understand why isn't ablation being adopted as much as possible. And you start looking at some of the factors around the margins of ablation, but you have to ask the 5 whys to get deeper and deeper and deeper, because what we end up doing is understanding, okay, well, if you get the right margins, and if you don't cause any ancillary structural damage on the way to your target, and if you manage to ablate where you want to ablate, it's a lot of ifs, then you can be successful. But what ends up happening is those are barriers. And for us, understanding to say, okay, now I really need to understand what is the type of margin that I need that is going to say, using a MediView product, we can say that there's going to be a safer or more effective outcome. Efficacy is obviously down the road for us, but we're already thinking that. And our internal regulatory group, Adam Cargill and his team, are saying, listen, if we ever want to do a PMA someday, we got to start thinking about how do we design the product today so that if it is put into a PMA, those are expensive and they take a long time, and if you're going to make that time and money investment, you have to have some predictability in, hey, this is where we hope the outcome comes out to be, and we do our diligence to say, then let's design our device, let's design in autonomous data collection from the device itself via sensors, imaging, et cetera, so that when we get to that point of wanting to demonstrate, hey, safer, potentially more efficacious down the road, you're not having to rewind the clock and start from scratch.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. Do you have anything to add, Nicole?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. You need to begin early to develop that long-term evidence strategy, and I think the pathway to market access isn't straightforward. I think it's very windy, and you really need to start early to strategize around what are the key questions that you need to answer, and how are you going to use data to answer those questions. And so I think starting even during your regulatory exploration and thinking about that market access downstream is very important.
Yeah, agreed. All right, we're going to go to the regulatory perspective.
In terms of regulatory, real-world evidence can be used for a number of applications, including supporting new indications. You can often see this when you are collecting real-world data on a device that's marketed in OUS and manufacturers are looking to support a clearance or approval for the US market. You can also use real-world data to expand or modify indications, such as when you're going from something like a general tool claim to something more specific. For example, if there is a surgical tool that has very general claims to cut and dissect, but then you're really going for an indication that supports specific surgeries, you might be able to collect real-world data on the marketed device in order to support those specific surgeries. You can also think about real-world data as really complementing traditional clinical trials. So, for example, you can use real-world data as a control arm for your clinical trial. It can also be used to establish objective performance criteria and performance goals. This is especially useful when the incidences of certain events that define your performance goal and your performance criteria is rare. And you're really looking at that volume of data in order to understand the incidences of these rare events. As we all have seen, real-world data is critical for post-marketing surveillance. And as we saw in the case study, real-world data can really be used to reduce some of the burden associated with post-market studies that often have direct-to-follow-up patients. So finally, FDA has accepted real-world data as a supplementary source of information in marketing submissions. So often what you'll see in these submissions is a regulatory application that includes a mix of both data collecting from traditional clinical trials as well as supplementary data and supporting data from real-world evidence.
Great. Thank you, Devjani. So the next question, overall, what are the benefits and challenges of using real-world evidence and real-world data from each of your perspectives?
Well, I think from a clinical standpoint, the benefit and the challenge could also be the same thing in study design. Because in order to set up a study design to gain the benefits of real-world data, you can have an easier study design. You can have a registry. You don't have to do an RCT. You can basically set up something where you're just collecting data and the cost is less. You can have it kind of going in the background, so it can be up to 5 years. But, and then the benefit of it is that you're actually obviously gaining what's going on in the real world. And for everything that we've discussed today, you know, you can use it for your clinical trials, your claims when you're out there and your physicians are telling you they're seeing the same thing. The challenges then also lie in study design, because you have to function in where do you get the real world data? How do you set it up? The HIPAA compliance with it, the signing of an informed consent in order to get the data. Sometimes it doesn't come as easy to look at a clinical trial to collect the real world data when you're looking at the design of it from a point of the HIPAA part of it. So it's challenging to collect the data and being able to submit to the FDA if you're looking at it from different aspects, such that we've talked about as far as digital health or remote monitoring or even patient health records. You know, all of that has crucial HIPAA information and would require some form of informed consent in order to get the data. So it really lies in itself in the two, but I think as we move forward, we work through those challenges. It's only been a couple of years now that we've been focused on this, and we're constantly coming up with new ideas and new ways to design clinical trials. You know, we've seen a huge evolution in decentralized trials that are showing benefit as far as, you know, keeping patients enrolled, follow-up, and then being less expensive. But overall, we are evolving into getting to where we need to be with this real-world data and evidence.
Nicole, what are some of the benefits and challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the benefits are really that there are possibilities. So I think that there's possibilities to answer a whole host of different questions. So, you know, I mean, from the payer perspective, I think some things that come to mind are, you know, you could begin to explore, you know, just the market in general. So what is your target population and what are the, you know, demographics around that population? What's the patient journey, for instance? If you're looking even through claims, you can start to develop a patient journey based on a diagnosis code or a procedure code and begin to understand the downstream patient journey. And you can start to identify gaps, right, in the current standard of care. So if you're looking at the current standard of care, you can start to identify gaps where, you know, your solution may be able to fill that gap. And you can start to sort of get a picture of the whole target population and the gaps and begin to address that. And then alternatively, if your product's already, kind of out there and you're able to access data that has your product in it, you can start to do the same kinds of things. So understand the user demographics, and they may be very different than what you initially expected, for instance. And you can also see sort of that patient journey. You can understand, provider or facilities. So there's almost like an endless amount of questions I think that you could ask, and I think similar to Gretchen, that's also the challenge.
Yeah.
So it could be very challenging to try to figure out what are the right questions to ask and how do you appropriately leverage the real world data in order to develop a good strategy for acquiring the evidence that you need to get that market access.
Yeah, so I think it made an important point again, using real world data early on to inform really what that strategy is, and doing a longitudinal claims analysis. That makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely.
Mina?
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges, right, is the structured collection of data. And I mean, by just saying the words, I am going to collect data, you're inherently introducing bias. And one of the things that we have to be careful about is when you define the type of data that you are going to collect, taking the bias away so you don't falsely create an outcome or evidence from the data. And I think that's really important, whether you're talking about analysis by humans or machines, it doesn't matter, that's very important. The other part of it that's a challenge is sometimes, for us, for example, we want to show efficacy, but that's a longitudinal process. Whereas some of the benefits, though, I mean, 3D printing I think is a really interesting one when you start talking about where it was, you really started out at the 3 level, eventually now it's considered standard of care for some of the procedures like in structural heart. You have to, well not have to, it's an aggressive word, I'm sorry, but it's encouraged to do some levels of 3D printing to avoid patient prostheses mismatch. And 3D printing is incredible because they were able to show that if you take a preoperative scan and you start sizing devices against that 3D print, that the likelihood of embolization, the likelihood of paravalvular leakage goes down. And that's incredible when you think about where 3D printing started and where it is today. So I think that's a really exciting opportunity for those type of, again, early identification of opportunity, but also thinking about, hey, for us right now, not used to having that mic there, the use of evidence to demonstrate earlier and maybe simpler value propositions. I don't know if anyone knows this, I didn't until I joined MediView, but ergonomic injury due to musculoskeletal disorder in this country is a $120 billion problem. And I thought that was a typo when I read the peer-reviewed publication, so I called the authors of the paper. They said, nope, and here's all the information we've gathered to come up with this, and our minimally viable product, right, there's a head-to-head study being done right now by one of our collaborators. I didn't even know this was a real thing. They're called an ergonomist, and they are showing that on quantitative and qualitative endpoints, that the use of a system like ours that you can look at a screen where you want to look at it actually helps with the ergonomics, and down the line, could it have an impact on, putting a small chip into that $120 billion problem? Yeah, it can. So I think that's one of the values is think about early wins that are still strongly supported to get market access with simple feature sets before really maturing and evolving to some of the other areas where, it's maybe a more longitudinal claim that you're trying to make.
Great. No, all fair points. We're going to hear from the regulatory perspective on the pros and cons now.
Really does understand the value of real world data, and they've put a lot of resources into it. They understand that, it really helps them get a better idea of device performance in real world environments, and it allows for the collection of outcome data that may not be feasible in a traditional trial, including long-term outcomes, and the ability to look at performance evaluated in a diverse patient population. and really the opportunity to partner with patients using wearable devices and mobile apps, and the benefits to sponsors in terms of reduction of time and cost. However, I think FDA has recognized really that the use of real-world data can be particularly challenging, given that there is an increased chance of data bias and residual confounds. So one of the main hurdles of using real-world data is really to ensure that there's appropriate mechanisms in place that the FDA agrees with to ensure that the data is really reliable and of sufficient quality to support a regulatory decision.
Great. Just one other question. Given the advent of remote patient monitoring, digital health therapies, and I think, more of an adoption and need for real-world evidence, does anybody foresee that becoming superior to traditional studies for any technology? Gretchen, got an opinion?
I don't. I think that there is still a need for RCTs, and I think that there's still a need to show that your device or your software, whatever you're trying to market, is better than or just as good as what's already previously out there. So I think there's always going to be a place for RCTs. I think the FDA is always going to want RCTs. I don't think we're going to get away from that in PMAs and pivotal studies. So I don't think it'll take over. Possibly for 510Ks. I mean, some of them don't even require clinical trials, right? So I think we could get to a place where we're using a lot of that for 510s, especially if we're trying for reimbursement purposes or market claims. I think that's an avenue.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, no, I feel similarly. I think there's always going to be a place for RCTs, except maybe in some of the 510Ks, but where you need to show clinical efficacy, I think it goes back to your point, Mina, that you have to control for bias. And you know, that's the whole point of the RCT, right, is to sort of eliminate bias and isolate the effect of the solution. And so I think from that standpoint, you're always going to need RCTs.
I think both of them said it perfectly, and they're really the experts in this space. But I mean, I fundamentally agree, especially on what type of, what product class are you talking about? I think the other part that we haven't touched on is the leveraging mechanisms like IRBs to inform the future evidence generation strategy is, I think, a very powerful thing to think about. So it's on the other side of the spectrum, so I'm going away from your question, right from the RCT side. But no, I mean, I don't think for class 3 and efficacy, you got to show things work. But like from a 510K perspective, we have some part of our strategy that will do some aspects of clinical trials and some of it that we won't because of the combination of IRB data. Of course, my reg guy will say, make sure you put the claim. None of this is 510K cleared, so you can't make any real world decisions on it yet. But you see indications of where trends are going on the 510K side, and obviously the bench. And if you can demonstrate, I think one of the things that has kind of been a theme, I'll just say explicitly from our world, is use condition analysis is a really important, I love how it was said, is you can build study design, but then what about the use condition in the real world? And these are non-ideal scenarios that we're in from a clinical perspective. People make decisions for the best care of the patient that may be counter, right, to the study that was built, and that's good for the patient.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing that we have to keep in mind at the end of the day.
We've got a few more minutes, and we have some case studies I know you guys want to talk about. So, Nicole, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll kind of go through this quickly because I know we're running out of time. But this is really from the payer perspective, and so I'm going back to my previous life when I was in the payer system at Highmark Health as part of the VITAL program. So we worked with a company that had a remote cardiac rehab program. And so here the unmet need is really that cardiac rehab programs do decrease hospital readmission rates by about 25%, but only about 10 to 20% of patients actually attend these programs in the brick and mortar setting. And so the solution that this company had was an evidence-based digital cardiac rehab program that consisted of a care management service, a web-based dashboard. They had a mobile app. They had some wearable and some interconnected devices. And really, the patients could do this at home. So it was all remote. And then their challenge was really, how do they obtain data that resonates with payers to drive coverage or reimbursement for their solution? And so, within the payer provider system at Highmark, we were able to basically leverage claims data to first understand the current state of cardiac rehab. So we were able to explore what is really the opportunity by leveraging retrospective claims analysis to understand first the target population, so what patients are eligible for cardiac rehab, and then what percentage actually attend cardiac rehab, and get some of those the stats around that, and then look at that patient journey longitudinally for the standard of care, identify some of the gaps, and really use it to drive the hypothesis for the potential impact of this remote cardiac rehab solution. And so, we were able to basically leverage this real-world data as a starting point for this solution. And then we went forward and piloted the solution in the health system to actually validate and understand that impact. So we collected, real-world data across clinical, economic, and experience dimensions. And then, we were able to validate some of the economic impact assumptions. So here we were looking at, not just cardiac rehab participation rates with the new remote solution, but also downstream readmission rates as a result. And we were able to understand, the impact of this solution, and essentially develop a real-world evidence package for the payer side.
And did it end up getting coverage and payment?
It's still in process, but the data looks lovely. So
Awesome.
TBD.
All right. Gretchen, you want to?
So here's a case story from a regulatory perspective. This is Devjani's world, and she'll chime in at the end here, but I wanted to set it up for everybody because the FDA, as a condition of approval for the PMAs, have requested post-approval studies, and these are large studies that sometimes could be as much as 1,500 patients and 5 years of follow-up, which in some of your guys' thoughts should be, wow, really expensive, because the more sites you have, the more expensive your study is. The more patients you have, the more expensive your study is. And then the longer term follow-up, 5 years, this is a very expensive study. And with the requirement from the FDA is very challenging for a corporation, not only on expense, but in what happens over that 5-year period. Because they ask for so many patients, you're looking at a very long time for enrollment. So you could be looking at upwards of 3 to 5 years just for that enrollment phase of it, and then afterward moving into the follow-up. And what also happens with a 5-year follow-up is struggles due to loss to follow-up with these patients. Some of these patients are cardiac patients that may not even make it 5 years. And other of are pain patients who might feel great after they got their neurostimulator and walk away. And then we're never able to collect any of that data. So what ends up happening is that it doesn't represent the real world. And when the companies have gone to the FDA and showed their post-approval results, it's not always where they expect it to be because of all of the struggles that they've been with. Devjani is going to come on now and talk about some ways to leverage real-world data as far as this regulatory perspective.
To address some of the challenges that Gretchen had highlighted with traditional post-approval studies, some of these manufacturers actually leveraged a combination of real-world data sources, including linking their own registries to a national death index to really assess the 5-year mortality of these patients. They also use national registries and claims data to determine the rate of device complications and hospitalizations, as well as get information on procedural complications. Finally, remote monitoring features of the device really allowed them to assess the long-term integrity of the device. So if you looked at how they traditionally were doing these post-approval studies where they're really looking at direct-to-patient follow-up, real-world evidence completely reshaped how these sponsors were able to address their post-approval requirements and allow them to address questions related to the long-term safety and effectiveness of their devices in really the least burdensome manner.
So I'll just sum that up with, I don't think we're going to get away from post-approval studies because the FDA approves the PMA based usually on efficacy and some safety, and then they really want that long-term safety. But what they have said and what Tonya noted in 2016 is that we can use now real-world data to suffice for that post-approval study. So I think we're in a great place with where we're at, being able to not have to spend so much time on post-approval studies.
Great, thank you. Mina, I know you touched on this earlier, but
I'll make it quick.
Okay.
I mean, what really our use case was in the world of atrial fibrillation, we started to understand, okay, there's recurrence, and this gets back to the whole thing. I mean, the Cabana trial demonstrated, this is not my opinion, that cardiac ablation can be as effective as antiarrhythmics, and if you live 3.4 years, it has a greater ROI over the lifetime of the patient. But again, actually delivering the therapy effectively and safely puts a big asterisk next to that. And what we found out is we actually started getting field complaints about catheters breaking in the field. And unfortunately, unlike our discussion today about early strategy around data collection, I had to manually mine 33,219, I remember it because I did it by hand, and tallied the number of times the free response text said, catheter failed in the right inferior pulmonary valve, or vein. Catheter failed in the left superior pulmonary valve. And what was crazy is that when we started mining the post-market surveillance data, we found that the greatest rate of failure in the field per reported post-market surveillance resulted in the right inferior pulmonary vein, which also lined up with many peer-reviewed studies showing that the greatest gaps in ablation showed up in the right inferior pulmonary vein. So what we did is we started asking ourselves, why are these both, is there some sort of relationship between the two? And what we found out is when that catheter broke, you actually couldn't ablate the posterior ridge of the right inferior pulmonary vein. And what we were able to do is actually build, and if anyone wants to nerd out with me about Monte Carlo analysis, please let me know. But basically, we were able to build a model that was part of our corrective action for the CAPA that demonstrated, okay, where this catheter is built, its capability, its strength, when you use it in a certain way, it reaches its yield point and breaks. And what we were able to say is based on statistical analysis of a 200 patient data set that we ran descriptive statistics on, we said there is a percentage of the patient population that has this really weird angle to go from the puncture to the right inferior pulmonary vein, and that percentage of patient population actually had representative recurrence data compared to our failure data that we captured in post-market surveillance. And I was jumping up like a little kid because I was like, I can't believe this is actually, and then when the model that we trended, we followed it in post-market surveillance for the next 2 years, and we were actually within 0.25% of prediction of where things failed. And it was, so that combination, really the summary of this is using the real world evidence in peer-reviewed literature to understand efficacy and therapy trends relative to product performance can impact how you design your solutions.
great, thank you. I'm going to ask the audience if anyone has questions before we go to kind of final thoughts from the panel. You guys have all hung in there?
Can we just do it from here? Yeah, another benefit would be understanding misuse of the product too, right, in real world data, and being able to tie that back into your design process. You know what I'm saying? And depending on how much misuse is out there,
Right.
regulatory bodies may require you to proactively study it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think you have a point there because you can also figure out, where it's being used off-label and where we want to study next, right? Are we seeing any results in an area that we think that we might be able to generate some data to get a PMA approval? In fact, the FDA is now even considering that when releasing approval for new indications. They are okay at some points looking at real world data or other ways that you found it to give a new indication. So that's very, very new, but yes, agree.
Okay. One other question.
Did you end up changing the catheter design, or making the recommendation to say, don't use it if you see the same?
No, I mean, so we don't follow that at all. I mean, we believe in the concept of robust design, that you should design the product to be robust in a variety of use conditions that are on label, and even if it's foreseeable misuse, if it's going to be used off-label, how do you design for it? And we actually ended up changing the lumen structure, the polymer material, the braid, the geometry, and actually changed the design of the catheter. And in the field, clinicians were like, yeah, it handles a little bit differently, but for once, you guys got something right where different actually means better this time. So that's, hopefully answers your question.
All right, so we are getting the happy hour bell right now, cut time. So thank you all for joining. I know it was a difficult time, but thank you so much. I hope this was really informative for everyone, and we will be around the conference the next couple of days, so please reach out to us. Thank you. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.